Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barlee. He's our storyteller and author and writer and researcher and a museum owner, too, I guess, these days. Tell me about the Boundary Country today. Grand Forks is where we're getting back to.
Yeah, we go one of those. This is one of these almost forgotten parts of British Columbia. Many other people in British Columbia aren't aware of the Boundary District and its rich history. Now, we've touched on it, Mike. We've touched on it before. But now we come into a place which was originally called La Grande Prairie. And that was named by the fur traders, and they frequented this area in the 1850s, the 1860s, and the 1870s. By the late 1860s, through this wide valley, and we have to get the picture, it's very close to the American border, verdant grass, lots of sunshine, two rivers coming through the valley, so there's grass and water, everything a cattleman needs. So when the Dewdney Trail goes through, it carries a lot of miners through, but they're on their way through. They're on their way east, Mike.
Going somewhere else.
That's right. They're going into the West Kootenai District, or they're going into the East Kootenai District, or maybe into the Big Bend. They're not stopping in La Grande Prairie. But the cattlemen do come in, and they're really the forerunner of the cattlemen is a guy called Jim McConnell. And Jim McConnell is working for Judge Haynes out of that South Okanagan country, and he treks 3,000 cattle over the Dewdney Trail. So he comes up over Anarchist, long trip, down into Rock Creek and past McKinney Creek, down the Kettle Valley, and right up through a rather difficult trail right up where Deadwood Mountain and down into this big valley, which they know as La Grande Prairie. So he's the first of many cowboys to come into the area, and he's followed by Gilpin and Jones, two other cattlemen. And they begin carving out their own empires here on two rivers, and the two rivers are the Kettle River and one they called then the North Fork. And the North Fork really is the Granby today. But it was then known as the North Fork, was known as the North Fork for many years. And then two other individuals follow. Ernest Spraggett, who had certainly the loudest voice in the Boundary Country, notorious character.
This is what he's remembered for, having the loudest voice?
Well, yeah, there's some interesting stories about Spraggett, which we'll allude to later on. And a guy called Sidney Almond. And all of these are long-time names in this Boundary Country. They're the originals. They are the first pioneers. Now, the interesting thing is that at that time, grass was the draw. But in other parts of British Columbia, for instance, by the 1880s, they're starting to make discoveries in Nelson, the Silver King. And by the early 1890s, a whole flood of discoveries come in through that southern interior country. And it attracts miners like a magnet from all across the Pacific slope, from Idaho, from Montana, from Washington State, from Oregon, from California, from eastern Canada. And they flood into places like the Silvery Slocan. They come into Rossland, of course, the famous Golden City. They come into Nelson. They come into various other parts of the West Kootenai. They come into the East Kootenai country. And then they just start to discover mines in the Boundary District. So they discover Phoenix, which is fabulous. They discover very close to Phoenix, the BC and the Oro. They discover Camp McKinney is another discovery, Deadwood, and it goes on and on. Now the miners start getting interested in the country directly around Grande Prairie.
Okay. When we come back, we'll take a look at how Grande Prairie changes to Grand Forks and talk about its history right after these words. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts, Bill Barlee. We're talking about, well, at this stage of the game, La Grande Prairie. Couldn't keep that name, though.
No, they couldn't keep the name, Mike, because there's another Grande Prairie actually in the north, between the North Okanagan country and Kamloops. So it began tentatively be known as Grand Forks, which of course described the junction of the two rivers. And in that area, they began going up prospecting very seriously up the Granby or the North Fork, and they came across a number of propositions that looked pretty good, especially Franklin Camp. Now, Franklin Camp became ultimately really quite a magnificent area for mining, but at that time it wasn't. And they came across little mines like the Golden Eagle and the Hummingbird and the Pathfinder and the Union, and of course the Rock Candy.
And rock candy.
Yeah, well, the rock candy really wasn't. It was just because of it provides flux for the smelter. There's a lot of quartz in the rock candy, various colors of rock and so on. And that's what it eventually shipped thousands of tons of ore into the Trail smelter eventually.
Did it have anything to do with the big rock candy mountain or anything like that?
Mike, I don't know whether it was named after that song or not. I know my dad worked at the rock candy mine in the 1900s, and my late father in the 1920s. And there's still signs of it there, and people go up there and pick up samples. But, however, I'm getting off the track a little bit here. So some of those properties were really considered world beaters. Now, they were never world beaters, but they were considered world beaters. And with the result that Grand Forks soon became kind of a division point. The railroad was coming into town, and it was a transportation center. There was mining interests all around the area. It was really the center of the boundary country. It was vying with Greenwood at that particular time. And Greenwood was going to be, they felt, the great metropolis of the boundary country. Grand Forks was convinced they were going to be the great metropolis of the boundary country. And a lot of people, such as the Henderson family here, were quite sure they were.
Then this, I mean, we've seen stock certificates before. They were not worth the paper they were printed on,
No.
but this one, worth $1, was for the Grand Forks Gold Mining Company.
Yeah.
Did it ever turn out to anything? I mean, was there ever a Grand Forks Gold Mining Company?
Well, yes, there was, but that was a paper company by the Henderson family, and it never really got off the ground. But the interesting thing to note, Mike, is that is 1896. It is now known as Grand Forks, and that's very early. Now, we'll take a look at this shot, which we see coming up on the screen right now, and this is very interesting, because this is probably Grand Forks in 1896. Now, it shows the Granby coming in the foreground, and the town just starting to take shape behind that, and in the background, that's Observation Mountain, which I found fascinating as a kid. I was born in Grand Forks, you see, Mike. Oh yes. And when I looked up at Observation Mountain as a kid in the 1930s, I saw a big crown, an illuminated crown up there, and that had been put there about the turn of the century. And it was really quite fascinating to me. And of course, at that time, I thought Observation Mountain was a huge mountain. Go back and look at it today. Doesn't look too big at all, Mike, at all.
That's the way it is with kids. The biggest house I was ever in was the one I was raised in as a kid. I went back to it. It was a dinky little place.
Well, sure.
That's right.
So Grand Forks starts to take shape, and by 1897, they're feeling so confident that they petition the provincial government to become an incorporated city. Now, their population is only 500, but they're granted their wish. Grand Forks becomes an incorporated city. By 1898, 1 year later, the population has doubled. They are really, really moving in the boundary country. They can boast 1,000 population, but up springs a rival. And the rival is about 1.5 miles west of Grand Forks. The Grand Forks people call it West Grand Forks, but the new town site holders call it Columbia. They have one advantage, Mike, and the advantage is this. The railway station, the CPR they put it smack dab in Columbia, but they call it Grand Forks. In the middle of this rival town site. And here's what the Grand Forks and Columbia people are all disturbed
There's
about.
a war of words going on here, undoubtedly.
Oh, most definitely. And one of the guys leading the assault against Grand Forks is a guy called Ross, A.W. Ross. So he writes the CPR. And I take this from Grand Forks, the first 100 years. This is by Alice and Jim Glanville. And they're old-time pioneers in the area. The family is. A good history of Grand Forks. And he says this to the magnets in the CPR. If you act now and promptly, we can get the best people to move from Grand Forks, and the scoundrels can stay. But their influence will be gone, and they can do no harm. Then he goes on to say, destroy the evil influence of Grand Forks and build up a city here in Columbia. I will point out a few things that can be done which would help us, and the time is opportune. For if a movement can be made as our people are beginning to feel better and have confidence. If we had got assistance 1 year ago, there would be practically no Grand Forks today. So he's really pushing the case.
The evil influence. This is real verbiage. This stuff. Now, what happens to the evil influence of Grand Forks? Obviously, nothing.
Not really much, because Grand Forks has a population of 1,000. Columbia, which we see here, just building. They have seven hotels, Mike. Number of other businesses, but only a population of 300. And several things happen to kind of dampen the spirits of these guys. One of the vice presidents of the land company is a guy called C.S. Morris. Now, C.S. Morris is on the letterhead of the land company brochures and all the proposals that they're sending out to people all over. Somebody has some sort of idea, and they get a picture of this guy, C.S. Morris, and they recognize he is not C.S. Morris. He is a guy called Charlie Hinckley. And Charlie Hinckley has a very checkered past. Charlie Hinckley was in New York City in 1885, which is just about 14 years before, and he made quite a splash in New York City, Mike. He embezzled $97,000. $97,000 in the Bank of New York City was not easily forgiven.
No, I can imagine.
You have to multiply it by what? 40 times, Mike.
40,
So that's an embezzlement today of, about 4 million.
He really gouged them.
That's right, he did gouge them. So he wakes up one morning, there's a knock on the door, he opens the door, and there are 3 New York City detectives plus a provincial policeman. They arrest Hinckley. He is taken to Rossland. And there he sits before the judge, and the judge looks at this case, and he realizes that Hinckley is a swindler on the grand style, and that he should be sent back. But he looks at the law, and it isn't an extraditable offense. So he suggests to Hinckley, Mr. Hinckley, he said, I think you should go back to Spokane and face the music.
Oh, sure.
No way.
Sure he did.
And there's no way Hinckley is going back to Spokane to face the music. Yeah. So he just wanders off, and Hinckley disappears from the scene. And of course, the town of Columbia is not far behind. And the reason, Mike, is there are several reasons. One is that Phoenix is now booming, and the copper ore is pouring out of Phoenix, and gold ore as well. And they have to establish a smelter where there's abundant water supply. They choose the North Fork.
Grand Forks.
That's right. They choose the North Fork River, right near Grand Forks, just above Grand Forks. They changed the name of the river to the Granby, and the Granby Company was the great company of Phoenix. And they shipped from the old Ironsides, and they shipped from the Nob Hill. And Mike, the interesting thing is, a lot of people don't know this, is that those ore trains that ran from Grand Forks to Phoenix and from Phoenix to Grand Forks made the round trip about 3 times a day, and they went 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from 1900 to 1919, practically 20 years.
Gee, that was wealth. The ore was inexhaustible.
Staggering. Between $80 and $90 million in ore, at the value then of gold at about $20 an ounce, and copper at just a few cents a pound.
So obviously you put a smelter at a place, the population's got to be there.
Well, what happened, Mike? They blow in the first part of the smelter in 1900, and then they add more and more and more as it goes on. Before long, there were 400 workers employed at the Granby Works in Grand Forks. And this smelter, as you can see from the various shots here, is one of the great smelters of the interior of British Columbia. Not only is it one of the great smelters of the interior, it is the greatest non-ferrous smelter in the British Empire, and one of the great copper smelters of the world. You see,
So you're making a distinction between an iron ore smelter
right.
and a copper smelter.
Yeah.
So it's the largest non-ferrous in
the British Empire.
The British
entirely.
Empire.
Sure. This includes India, Australia, Great Britain, of
right
course.
In Grand Forks.
Yeah, right in Grand Forks, right in Little Grand Forks. And of course, what happens is, of course, over the years, over 16 million tons of ore are shipped into the Granby smelter in Grand Forks. And as you can see from the various interior pictures, it's quite an establishment indeed.
Well, obviously, it was going to be the center of activity in Grand Forks or in the boundary country, and it succeeded. And some of these shots of the growth of the place really show you a tremendous town site.
Yeah, they do. And what you find here is that, first of all, Grand Forks attracts all the amenities of a town. You know, it has about 10 or 15 hotels. It has a theater. It has 3 banks. You know, it has the Royal Bank. It has the Eastern Townships Bank. It has the British American Trust. It has a number of bordellos, and the bordellos are the Blue Goose and the Harem and the Mascot and the Second Office and the inhabitants.
Second Office.
The Second Office. Yeah.
What a cheeky name for their bordello.
Yeah, and it was a very busy town. I mean, the next shot shows some teamsters coming down the main street, and I think this shot is probably, Mike, about 1897, because this is probably prior to the railroad. These guys are almost definitely hauling in from Marcus. They're hauling in from the east. When the railroad comes, it pretty well puts them out of business. Yeah. And so that Grand Forks is really becoming a cosmopolitan town. And of course they have a number of hotels, and I think the most famous, you know, you have the Yale, and you have the Grand Forks, and you have the Winnipeg, and you have the Province, and half a dozen others. And by the way, they charged each hotel owner $1,000 per annum. City Council in Grand Forks.
That is steep business license.
That's heavy business license.
1897, right? Around that time?
Yeah, but the biggest hotel, and I think probably, and the people in Nelson will debate this, but I think probably the grandest hotel in the interior is the Yale, the original Yale, sitting right down by the banks of the Granby.
Look at the turret there. I mean, is that turret the way it was originally constructed?
Yeah.
What a magnificent structure.
Oh yeah, marvelous structure, and
overlooking the scenic Granby. What a
you know, it's marvelous. It has dozens and dozens, scores of rooms actually, and it's just one of the hotels in town.
And any hotel worth its salt, of course, has its own china, and the Yale Hotel, no different. There it is embossed right on the plate here.
Yeah.
That's is this a tough thing to get hold of as a collector of artifacts?
Yeah, the reason why, Mike, is because the original Yale, the first Yale Hotel, burns. It burns to the ground in 1908. Devastating loss, along with much of the business district down by the Granby. Almost 2 blocks go in that 1908 fire. It just vanishes. But you know, it doesn't stop Grand Forks. They rebuild on those blocks again. And you can see the photographs of the fire here and show how devastating it is, especially near, on that part of the street.
What's that large concrete or block building right in the...
Mike, that's certainly a vault. Now, whether that's the vault, the hotel vault of the Yale, or one of the banks, I can't really say. And there's no indication on the photograph. And these photographs are from the Boundary Museum in Grand Forks. Nothing on the back of it to indicate whether it's from the hotel or whether it's from one of the banks. Could be either. But it remains intact, as you see.
Having the smelter there obviously means, this place is there for a long time, so they can rebuild.
And they thought the smelter ore would run forever, so they rebuilt. Another fire hits in 1911. 3 years later, devastates part of the town again, much of Bridge Street and other parts of the town, but it survives, and it comes right through that intact and still building for the future.
There are some great characters associated with Grand Forks. As if you didn't know, we'll address that subject when we come back after this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. As you might expect, a town like Grand Forks would attract a character or two, but some of the ones you've told me about, most unlikely heroes. Tell me about some of them.
Well, I think this first shot will tell us something. This is one of the great mansions of Grand Forks. This is the Averill Mansion, named after Dr. C.W. Averill. He was a dentist, and he went out to the various mining camps and really did the circuit of mining camps, carried with him a number of gold coins, and he would melt them down and put in bridge work and all the rest of it, and built a mansion for his wife who didn't want to live in Grand Forks. And it's marvelous, and here's the mansion in all its glory. Stained glass window, turret, veranda, right up there with a wide expanse, a view of both rivers. And by the way, Mike, that building still stands today. It's in danger.
What a treasure.
Yeah, it is. It really is a treasure, and I think it should be saved because it's very worthy of saving. And the interesting thing is a number of people looked at it, they haven't bought it. And there is a story, and a very, very, fairly well documented, that the place is haunted because the Averill family fell into, great misfortunes later on in their career. One of the children died, and he fell into very serious illness. And the story is that it's haunted, and there's a woman weeping in the top story of the house in one of the bedrooms. And this has been verified by a number of people. So I don't usually tell haunted house stories, but this is kind of an interesting one.
And the fact that it's still there and dates back and is a linchpin of this community.
Yeah. And it's not the only one. Mining was still extant, and they went back into Franklin Camp, and there's an example right there, Mike.
This thing, what's special about this?
Well, that is really quite unique. It isn't usually your burlap bag to hold ore. This is to hold high-grade ore.
This is canvas, yeah.
That's right, where they sewed it together, Mike. They sewed it together so nobody would be dipping into that bag to take out some high-grade ore. And this was from the famous Union mine. And the famous Union, of course, was up the North Fork. And in the 1920s, it came back into its own with a bang. They started mining ore that was so fabulously rich, they got up to 40 ounces a ton, 41 ounces a ton. They sent one shipment of ore out of there, Hecla Mining Corporation, one of the great mining giants of the Northwest, and it averaged 41 ounces to the ton, and they sent out $43,000 worth of ore. And this is before the price of gold goes up. It's staggering, absolutely staggering. And here is the last of the old company seals. And
do I get to manipulate this?
You can have that. Yes. This is the last and the greatest of the company seals, and this is a mining company seal. And guess whose name is on it? Press it down this way, Mike. Okay.
Far enough?
That's far enough. And if you take that out, you will see, if you hold it up, that this says the Union Mining Company. And it's really quite spectacular. And that was out of Grand Forks, got it some years ago, and really a very nice artifact.
What a thing to have. May I do that again? I just want to feel...
Well, sure you can.
Okay, I want to feel like, who is the man who would use this? This is the president of the company, or his treasurer, his controller?
The treasurer.
Yes, here's your dividend check, madam.
Yeah.
And it's done
and it's signed and sealed.
What a cake.
Now, this is a mining company, but there were other guys in there that were equally as fascinating. I think one of the most intriguing characters ever to walk down Bridge Street in Grand Forks was a guy called Bill Peerage. But he was never called Bill. He was called Haywire Bill, Barbed Wire Bill, Rattlesnake Bill. And his idea of a nice, comfortable afternoon was to go hunting rattlesnakes and kill as many as he could. Sometimes with dynamite, sometimes with a gun. And he was an amazing character. I remember him very well, Mike, as a kid, and later as a young man. And he was about 5 feet 4 inches tall, but he was wide, very heavily built man, extremely powerful. In fact, my father told me a story about it once. They were in Grand Forks, and a circus came to town. And one of the big draws for the circus, where they'd have a big wrestler in there who was very well known, and they would offer any local guy $50. And that was a lot of money in the Depression. That was the early 1930s. $50 if they could pin their wrestler. Never been done. They'd gone all through the interior of British Columbia, in some very tough towns like Salmo and Trail and
their fair
Rossland.
share of rough customers.
You bet they did. Nobody pinned this wrestler. And so the guy said, Peerage, there's $50 in this. So he gets up, sheds his jacket, walks out in the ring, and this guy grabs him, Peerage grabs him and slams him over the shoulder onto the mat, pins him in about 5 seconds. And the owners were just staggered. Then they tried to worm out of it, and the guys went to the edge of the tent and started rocking the tent back and forth, and they were going to pull the whole tent down. They said, okay, we'll pay the $50. Peerage is $50 richer.
Rattlesnake Bill Peerage.
Yeah.
Other names? I'm sorry, my mind fails me. What were some of his other names?
Well, Rattlesnake Bill Peerage, Barbed Wire Bill Peerage, and sometimes Haywire Bill Peerage.
Right.
He had a number of different names.
I got him in my mind now.
Sure, and he wasn't the only guy. There were lots of guys there. There were guys like Volcanic Brown, and Volcanic Brown had 7 nicknames, 6 or 7. Volcanic Brown, Gold Tooth Brown, Northport Brown, Bedbug Brown, Crazy Brown. Those are just some of them. And he had a mine up that North Fork, Mike, he thought was a world beater, and he called it Volcanic Mountain. And he drove in there hundreds of feet, all by himself, single-jacking all the way, and he said that mine is going to be so rich, Mike, that all the lead pencils in Grand Forks can't add it up, and I'm going to have no banks, didn't like banks at all, no churches, didn't like churches, no schools, but he'd have 4 railroads coming in there, one from the north, one from the south, one from the east, and one from the west. Nothing ever came of it, of course, although he was really quite a spectacular character.
He was just spouting off.
Sure he was.
Okay.
And I think one other thing we should mention is that there is kind of a lost treasure story in that area, and the Mamel family can tell you about it, but so could my late father. Up in Morrissey Creek, a number of different times over the last 40 or 50 years, there's been some high-grade silver float found. And Morrissey Creek is a creek.
Float is ore, chunks of
That's
rock.
very,
ore.
very high-grade silver. And it isn't galena. It's high-grade silver, and it just is actually spectacular. Everyone's triangulated. They've gone back and forth in the Morrissey Creek area, and they have not been able to find it. And I think that's in the middle of a mineral belt. Close by, I think there's some little ledge up there in the Morrissey Creek area that somebody's going to stumble across someday.
All you have to do is get there. All you have to do is find that float that
That's
was
right.
found, how long ago, 1920s?
1920s, and then
Yeah.
1930s, 1940s.
Just great. Grand Forks started off as La Grande Prairie, had its fights, had its fires, but the Granby smelter was the thing that kept it cooking, and the subject of our story tonight on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Thanks for being along. We'll bring up more stories of British Columbia's amazing past next time. Join us then for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Bye-bye.